Okay, so today we're diving into a pretty intense book.
Yep.
It's not exactly a light read. It's a real deep dive into, well, some pretty dark and unsettling aspects of the human mind.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart.
No, not at all. We're talking about psychosis, but we're not just going to skim the surface here. We're
Right.
going deep into personal accounts, from people who've really experienced these states firsthand.
Yeah, and some pretty disturbing art that comes out of these experiences.
Exactly. And then we'll try to make sense of it all through the lens of psychoanalysis.
Which I have to say can be pretty mind-bending stuff in its own right.
No doubt about it. So just a heads up, this is going to be a challenging deep dive.
Oh, yeah. It's going to challenge a lot of our assumptions about sanity, reality, even what it means to be a self.
Right. But hopefully it'll be a revealing journey too.
I think so.
I think so. Okay. So the book starts off by throwing us right into the deep end with Tumis Tranströmer, the poet, and his adolescent experience of what he calls dread.
Oh, yeah. Intense stuff.
Yeah. And it wasn't just your typical teenage angst. This was something much darker, really disturbing. He describes feeling like he was just an observer, like something was deeply wrong.
Right, like his mind was being taken over by something completely alien.
Yeah.
And that feeling of being completely overwhelmed, of losing control, that's a kind of a recurring theme in the book.
Absolutely. And it really sets the stage for everything that follows. Then we're introduced to 5 writers: Ken Steele, Carol North, Whitney Robinson, Barbara O'Brien, and Edith Weisskopf-Jolson. They each give these really raw, first-person accounts of encountering what they call the other.
It's like this bizarre, almost entity that invades their consciousness. Really unsettling stuff.
Totally. So let's start with Ken Steele. His experience is particularly striking. He suddenly starts hearing these voices, these intrusive, directive voices, especially when he's around media, like the TV or radio.
It's like the media is amplifying the voices somehow,
Yeah.
acting as a conduit, almost. And the voices themselves are so contradictory. They tell him to do something and then immediately berate him for doing it.
Right. It's like this constant internal torment. And then there's this disintegration of language that he describes, words losing their meaning, becoming this jumble of sounds. But at the same time, they're imbued with this strange, almost sinister significance.
Yeah. It's a disruption of the symbolic order, as Lacan would say. The framework of language and social norms that we use to make sense of the world. That breaks down.
Right. And Barbara O'Brien's experience is equally disturbing. She's convinced that she's been chosen for some kind of twisted experiment, and that her thoughts are completely exposed, constantly being read and confirmed by these unseen operators.
It's a complete loss of privacy. Like, her thoughts are no longer her own. And this entity, this Bert, he seems to validate her every thought, which just reinforces this feeling that she's completely lost touch with reality.
Exactly. And then we have Edith Weisskopf-Jolson. Her story takes us into this realm of intensely personalized logic. The way she interpreted everyday occurrences, like finding a Jewish encyclopedia or hearing the nuns chanting "Change Flightly" during the Litany of the Saints to include the word Dreyfus.
She saw these things as direct messages, coded messages, intended only for her. It's like she's trying to find meaning in a world that suddenly feels saturated with hidden significance.
Right, and it's all connected in this very idiosyncratic way. The Dreyfus case, Mother Garen, all these disparate elements become woven into her own personal mythology.
A mythology that, while utterly real and convincing to her, is completely inaccessible to anyone else.
Absolutely. And then we have Carol North, the childhood experiences, which really blur the lines between imagination and reality. She describes these terrifying, murderous birds and this disorienting voice that would offer guidance one minute and then just utter gibberish the next.
It highlights how fragile that boundary between imagination and reality can be, especially in childhood. And that voice, shifting so suddenly, really underscores the unpredictable and untrustworthy nature of these internal experiences.
Right, like a fundamental betrayal. And Whitney Robinson, she describes this pervasive feeling of being different, of being out of sync with her peers. And the book raises this question: how much of this feeling is being interpreted in retrospect through the lens of her later diagnosis?
Yeah. I mean, how many of us go through those feelings of isolation and strangeness as adolescents? It's a good question. Where does typical teenage angst end? and something more profound begin.
Exactly. And Edith, she echoes this feeling of being fundamentally different, even describing herself as perpetually childlike. Like she's always struggling to grasp the unspoken rules of social interaction, feeling like she's from another planet.
She really struggled with that implicit social knowledge, you know? It wasn't a lack of intelligence, it's more like a fundamental disconnect from the shared understanding that most of us rely on in social situations.
Right. And then there's her recurring dream of this magical place in the Vienna woods, which later clashes so starkly with the very real threats she faced as a Jewish woman in Vienna.
That dream, that early sense of refuge and safety, becomes tainted by the trauma of her later experiences. It's a really powerful juxtaposition.
Yeah. And then there's that anecdote about her father trying to reappear in disguise and her utter inability to lie to the Nazi lieutenants. It's like this pathological honesty, even when facing mortal danger.
It's almost like she can't put up those social facades that most of us use to navigate difficult situations. Like she's constantly being watched, so there's no point in pretending.
Right. And the author, she brings in her own childhood experiences too. You know, this feeling of being somehow away from her body and this deep belief in the reality of her stuffed animals.
It's a reminder that these experiences, these altered perceptions, they're not limited to people who get a diagnosis. They're part of this broader spectrum of human experience.
Absolutely. So then the book shifts gears a bit and introduces us to Dan, whose brother has just been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And Dan's initial understanding of schizophrenia is pretty stereotypical. You know, he thinks of someone talking to themselves, behaving erratically.
It's that very public, kind of sensationalized image of psychosis that we often see in the media, but it doesn't really capture the complexity of the lived experience.
Right. And Dan asks this really important question. How different is it, really, from the way his own mind works? He talks about his own experiences with hallucinations, you know, during sleep or when he's been drinking. And he mentions his friend who had auditory hallucinations during a period of intense grief.
And that raises a really crucial point. Hallucinations in and of themselves aren't necessarily a sign of psychosis. The key difference seems to be in the attribution. In psychosis, these experiences are often attributed to some external force, some alien presence.
Exactly. So then the book touches on Julian Jaynes's bicameral mind theory, which is this fascinating, albeit controversial idea that early humans experienced their own thoughts as the voices of gods.
It's a really intriguing attempt to explain the origin of inner voices, to place them in an evolutionary context.
Right. And then we get into Eugene Bleuler's work, which is much more nuanced. He really delves into the nature of these voices in schizophrenia, emphasizing their connection to the individual's overall mental state and their delusional beliefs.
Bleuler's descriptions of these voices are incredibly vivid and disturbing. They're often persecutory, contradictory, sometimes localized within the body in really bizarre ways.
Yeah, and even inanimate objects can be perceived as speaking. It's this constant barrage of negativity and torment, like each mouthful is stolen, or if only your foot had been chopped off. Just horrific.
Really highlights the relentless and invasive nature of these internal experiences.
Absolutely. So then Dan asks this very practical question. If his brother has schizophrenia, is medication the only solution? And this leads into a really complex discussion about treatment and recovery.
Right. And the book makes it clear that medication isn't always the answer. It can be helpful in managing symptoms, but it's not a cure. And it often comes with significant side effects.
Yeah. Dan talks about his brother being washed out, gaining weight, having problems with his blood pressure. It's a real dilemma, trying to balance the potential benefits of medication with the potential downsides.
And then the book brings in Robert Whitaker's critique of the dopamine hypothesis. He argues that long-term use of antipsychotic medication might actually make some people more biologically vulnerable.
Right, it's a very controversial perspective. And then there's the research suggesting that people who use antipsychotics for shorter periods or who are able to discontinue them altogether might actually have better long-term outcomes.
So it's really complicated. There's no easy answer. The decision about medication has to be made on a case-by-case basis, carefully weighing the potential risks and benefits.
Absolutely. And then we move into the realm of psychoanalysis, which is where things get really interesting. The book focuses on Lacan's perspective, which is quite different from the traditional medical model.
Yeah. Lacan's not looking for some biological defect in the brain. He's focused on the structure and function of language itself and how it shapes our experience of reality. For him, psychosis isn't a disease, it's a kind of structural organization within language.
Right. And he sees hallucinations not just as perceptions that lack an external object, but as perceptions that actually subvert the subject. It's not just about seeing or hearing things that aren't there. It's about this fundamental disruption of your sense of self in relation to those perceptions.
Exactly. It undermines your sense of agency, your sense of coherence.
Right. In the case of Daniel Paul Schreber, he becomes really central to Lacan's understanding of psychosis. Schreber's memoir is this incredibly detailed and often bizarre account of his own psychotic experiences. He describes these miracles and these little men that are constantly present in his life.
It's a really rich and complex case study that Lacan analyzed extensively.
Yeah, and one of Lacan's key ideas is that in psychosis, the subject becomes a kind of second copy of their own identity, constantly multiplying and disintegrating in relation to this imaginary other.
It speaks to this profound fragmentation of the self that happens in psychosis.
Right. And the book emphasizes how important writing was for Schreber. It was a way for him to grapple with his experiences, to try to articulate them, even if he had to invent new language to do so.
It was a way for him to impose some kind of order on his chaotic inner world.
Exactly. And then there's this really interesting paradox. For Schreber, being alone in silence, without the constant barrage of thoughts and voices, was actually agonizing. It was his delusion, as bizarre and terrifying as it was, that gave him a sense of purpose and meaning.
So in a way, the delusion was a kind of defense mechanism, a way of coping with this overwhelming fragmentation of reality.
Right. So then the book moves into the realm of art, exploring what it calls the incandescent alphabets of psychotic art. And this is where we really see the intensity of these inner worlds expressed visually.
The book draws heavily on Hans Prinzhorn's collection of art made by people in psychiatric institutions. He saw this art not as the random scribblings of madmen, but as a unique form of expression, a direct inscription of inner experience.
Right. And one of the most striking things you see in this art is the recurring motif of the dismembered body. Like in the work of Paul Gauche, you see these floating, fragmented forms. It's really unsettling.
It's like a visual representation of the disintegration of the self that we were just talking about.
Exactly. And the author, she even shares her own hallucinatory experience where she saw dismembered bodies in the water.
It really brings home the visceral nature of these experiences and how jarring they can be.
Totally. And then there's this drawing by Jacob Moore with all these arrows and script, which the book connects to Lacan's concept of jouissance. It's like this raw, untamed energy invading the body.
It's a really powerful image of being overwhelmed by this external force.
Right. And then we have August Natterer, whose art is all about trying to reconfigure time and the cosmos. And it's this interesting paradox because he seems to have this profound sense of knowledge and revelation, but at the same time, his work is clearly the product of cognitive disorder.
It's like he's been given access to these profound secrets, but he can't quite articulate them in a way that makes sense to others.
Right. And Hyacinth Freiherr von Weiser, his work is full of these transparent heads, this overwhelming sense of inner confusion.
It really conveys that feeling of mental turmoil, that breakdown of coherent thought.
Yeah. And Natterer's witch's head, it's this terrifying image like a gateway into another completely alien universe.
It really captures that sense of psychosis opening up these terrifying new realms of experience.
Absolutely. And then we have Alois Corbaz, who had these expansive cosmic visions and this powerful identification as a demiurge.
It's a grand delusion, this complete reimagining of her identity and the universe around her.
Right. And Camille Claudel, her sculpture Clotho, it's such a powerful image of the destructive potential of psychosis.
Her story is a tragic example of how psychosis can derail even the most brilliant artistic mind.
Yeah. And the book also touches on Deleuze and Guattari's body without organs and Kristeva's notion of objection, which are pretty abstract concepts, but they try to capture this fundamental disruption of the individual's experience of their own body in psychosis.
It's a really disturbing and difficult experience to describe.
And then we see glimpses of Henry Darger's work, this incredibly complex and fantastical world that he created, and Dwight McIntosh, whose artistic language is almost like an inscription on the body.
Both of them created these really unique and powerful ways of expressing their inner worlds.
Right, and the book highlights these recurring themes in psychotic art. Unenterable spaces, irreconcilable figures, unusable objects, unreadable text. It's like a world operating under a completely different set of rules.
A world that's very alienating and disorienting.
Absolutely. And then there's this breakdown of language that happens in psychosis. Words become these floating signifiers, disconnected from their usual meaning. And we see this creation of private codes using clocks, calendars, invented scripts as a way of trying to reimpose order on a disordered reality.
It's a desperate attempt to make sense of a world that's become utterly incomprehensible.
Right. And we see this in August Klett's invented language, in Barbara Suxel's fragmented writing style, in von Weiser's geometric portraits, which eventually led him to retreat into a purely mental act of creation.
All these different ways of trying to find new forms of expression, new ways of communicating what's happening internally.
Right. And this need to find new ways to represent time, that seems like a particularly important characteristic of psychosis. It's like the normal flow of time has been disrupted, fractured.
Yeah. The boundaries between past, present, and future become blurred. It's incredibly disorienting.
So then the book introduces this concept of la langue, which is Lacan's term for the raw, pre-symbolic dimension of language.
It's like the pure sound and rhythm of language before it gets burdened with meaning.
Right. And the book includes this short play featuring writers like Barbara Suckfull, Robert Walser, Janet Frame, James Joyce, Emily Dickinson, and Thomas Tranströmer as examples of writers who experimented with and reinvented language.
All of them push the boundaries of language in their own unique ways.
Yeah, and Lacan was particularly interested in James Joyce, arguing that Joyce's later writing, especially Finnegan's Wake, essentially became its own la langue.
Like he transcended the limitations of conventional language and tapped into something much more primal.
Right. And then there's this idea that truth is often half said, and this concept of the synhome, which is something that evokes the real, that which lies outside the symbolic order.
It's a reminder that language can only take us so far. There are experiences that always exceed our ability to put them into words.
Absolutely. So then the book shifts to this really crucial topic, the address in psychosis. And it talks about how difficult it can be for people experiencing psychosis to speak about their experiences in a way that others can understand.
And it's not just a matter of finding the right words. Often their communication is directed at something else entirely, some perceived all-knowing other.
Right, like that anecdote about the young psychiatrist who completely misinterprets the patient's reality.
It shows how easy it is to misunderstand, to miss the point entirely.
Yeah, and the book argues that sometimes what seems like incoherent rambling is actually a form of communication, but it's directed at this other that exists only within the person's delusional system.
So it's not just about listening to the words, it's about trying to understand the world that those words are coming from.
Right, and then there's that letter from someone experiencing intense delusions, and despite the bizarre content, there's this underlying plea to be taken seriously.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of these really strange and disturbing experiences, there's still this fundamental human need for connection and validation.
Absolutely. And the book talks about the importance of accepting the reality of lasting affliction in some cases, and even recognizing the potential gifts that might come with these experiences.
It's not about romanticizing suffering, but about acknowledging that there might be unique insights and perspectives that come from these altered states.
Right. And then the book highlights the work of Rosenbaum and Son, who emphasize the importance of really listening to people diagnosed with schizophrenia without judgment, with empathy.
They provide a really valuable framework for how to engage with people experiencing psychosis in a meaningful way.
Like that example of the interviewer just saying, as the patient talks. It's such a simple gesture, but it conveys so much.
It creates this space for the patient to speak, to feel heard, without being interrupted or corrected.
Exactly. And the book also mentions Canton's approach of listening to both delusion and dreams, and Sass and Parnas's research on disturbances in ipseity, the sense of self.
All these different approaches are trying to get at the complexity of psychosis, at the fact that it's not just about symptoms, it's about the individual's whole experience of themselves and the world around them.
Right, and then the book challenges this very idea of a normal self-experience as being continuous and whole. It draws on Lacan's view that the self is inherently fractured, reorganized by language from the moment of birth.
So psychosis might not be a deviation from some stable norm, but just a different way of negotiating that underlying fragmentation.
Right. And maybe that means that people experiencing psychosis might actually welcome questions about their experiences rather than just feeling pathologized and dismissed.
It's about approaching them with genuine curiosity, trying to understand their world on their own terms.
Absolutely. And then there's Jonathan Redmond's case study of Adam, who had these transient psychotic symptoms linked to his grandmother's illness. It really highlights the role of identification and how intertwined our emotional and physical experiences can be.
It's a fascinating case, showing how a bodily symptom can actually serve as a way of stabilizing the psyche.
Right. And the book also touches on this idea of ordinary psychosis, where a clear diagnosis is elusive. It suggests that psychotic experiences might be more common than we think.
And it challenges this neat binary between psychotic and non-psychotic.
Exactly. And then the analysis of that passage from Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man, it's a great example of how literature can illuminate these complex psychological concepts.
It's a really nuanced depiction of the open ego, this detachment from emotional responses.
Right. So finally, the book tackles this question of how psychoanalysis can be adapted to work with psychosis. It explores Lacan's later teachings, the concept of the synthome, and this idea of listening for the nonsense and musicality of language.
It's about moving away from the traditional focus on interpreting hidden meanings and trying to understand the individual's unique way of structuring their relationship to the real.
Right. And the book reframes psychosis not as a breakdown, but as a kind of grappling with an enigma. And the person's speech, even if it seems bizarre, is seen as an attempt at repair, at making meaning.
It's a much more hopeful perspective, seeing the potential for creativity and agency even in the midst of these really challenging experiences.
Absolutely. And the book concludes with this powerful image of these incandescent alphabets of psychotic expression arising from a profound silence at the edge of a void.
It's a beautiful way of capturing the emergence of meaning and expression from the depths of silence and chaos.
Right. And then the question becomes, how can psychoanalysis be reimagined to meet the challenges of psychosis?
It requires a real willingness to think outside the box, to be creative, to work at the limits of language and understanding.
Yeah. And the book offers some hope through the experiences of psychoanalysts like Dr. Belknap and Charles Turk. They talk about the importance of attending to developmental needs, of acknowledging the anxieties of both the patient and the therapist, of communicating in ways that go beyond words.
It's about being present, being patient, being willing to meet the person where they are.
Right. And they've seen some really remarkable successes, even with people who were considered untreatable.
It's a reminder that even in the most difficult cases, there's always hope for transformation.
Absolutely. And the book ends by describing this threshold experience and analysis where the person is able to name their delusion, to experience a shift in their relationship to that persecutory other, and to take a new place in the social world.
It's a vision of profound healing and integration.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone deep into personal accounts, into art, into psychoanalysis, and it's been intense, challenging, at times disturbing.
No doubt. But hopefully, it's also been illuminating.
Absolutely. This book uses strong language. It doesn't shy away from the difficult stuff, but that's because it's dealing with experiences that are inherently intense and often terrifying.
It's not a subject that lends itself to easy answers or superficial explanations.
Right. So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given everything we've explored, what does it really mean to inhabit one's own mind? And how do we approach those whose inner worlds are so radically different from our own?
That's a question worth wrestling with.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It has.